My name is David Garvin, and I am your conference treasurer and your director of administrative services. It is my joy and privilege to serve you and to serve our churches in this capacity. And so I work closely with our conference finance team. I work with our board of trustees. I work with our board of pensions. I get the distinct joy of working with people like Heather and others on the administrative services team and some of the cabinet who are here as well. And out of administrative services and my role, we hope we're striving, like you are in your administrative roles, to tend to the administrative matters in the life of the conference for the sake of the mission and the ministry of the conference. And so that's what we try to do. We want to be there to equip you, to support you, to resource you. And I think Heather passed around a sheet at the beginning of her presentation outlining some of the ways that the people here at the conference office can support and equip you for the good ministries that you do in your local church setting. So never hesitate to reach out to us. You are not alone. There's also, though, beyond the people, there are a variety of other resources. Again, I think Heather has shared about some of these. Again, documents, templates, one-page summaries. Please use these resources. All of them are available on our conference website. Or again, you can call and we would be happy to point you in the right direction. You're not alone in the work that you do. We are, in fact, connected. We are connected. So as we jump into this trustee work, well, I got to figure out how to work this. There we go. Trustees, who are the trustees? Just in a very foundational way. I may be saying things that you already know, but who makes up the trustees? How does that committee look there in the local church? Again, there's not fewer than 3, but there should not be more than 9. Anybody have more than 9? No? Anybody have fewer than 3? Yes. Yes? Well, the discipline is helpful. The discipline says no fewer than 3, no more than 9. And there is a suggested breakdown of how our trustee teams should look. And it talks a little bit about gender. It even talks about church members and non-members. That's a question we get often. Can a non-member be a part of the trustees? And the discipline says yes, but there are certain limits. And you can read those here. Trustees often, by discipline, should be arranged into classes. And so you can imagine 3 classes of 3 members. And you say, how then do they function? How do trustees organize themselves? You have a chairperson, a vice chairperson, and a secretary. The trustees elect those officers for themselves, and they serve in 1 year. There's a couple of other notes there that you can read about the chairperson, about the officer roles. But then a question that we get often is about quorum. And the answer's already on the slide. But for the trustee work, a majority of the members need to be present to constitute a quorum. Or said differently, a majority of the members need to be present for a vote to become official. There's a lot of other church committees where we say, whoever shows up, those present constitute an official quorum. But the trustees are a little bit different. It must be a majority of the members. They need to be present for any action or vote to be official. The trustees, how then does this group of people that has been organized, how does it work together with other groups throughout the church? And I think this is probably one of the most important pieces of trustees relating to other groups throughout the church. One of those groups that the trustees connect with often is the charge conference. They work also with the Administrative Council. Again, the Administrative Council is that group that oversees and coordinates the fullness of the life of the church. And so many trustee decisions are collaborative between the church council and the trustees, conversations that go back and forth. The trustees work often also with the finance committee. And I keep doing this. I want to make sure I can...
Paper matches?
Yeah, make sure it all matches here. But the Committee on Finance, the trustees, again, when they're functioning at their best, they're having a lot of conversations also with the finance folks, ensuring that there's funding available for the work that the trustees might seek to do. The Staff Parish Relations Committee, or the Pastor Parish Relations Committee, again, it's an important body that the trustees also relate to, so that they can hear from those groups about the needs of the building or the needs of the parsonage. And then finally, other ministry teams. Again, when the trustees are operating at their healthiest, they're having conversations with the ministry teams, with the worship folks or the children's folks, figuring out what those teams need, and then deciding and understanding how can the trustees come alongside to support them in their ministry. So I'm going to pause here for just a minute, because I think this is one of the most important parts of trustee work, and you'll hear me say it over and over. But it really is the trustees figuring out, learning, collaborating, not operating in a vacuum, but the trustees in conversation with all of the rest of the church, pulling together and supporting one another in the decisions that might need to be made. Any questions about that? All right, pressing on. What about specific responsibilities that the trustees have? Of course, the trustees, one of the most foremost responsibilities is managing church property. And I'm going to go ahead and click through all of these here. The trustees are responsible also for the administration of investments, endowments, estate gifts that might come their way. The trustees are the ones who are the leaders for the church on insurance matters, as well as, if I skip to the bottom, issues related to incorporation. And I will admit to you that just about any one of those bullets, any one of those trustee responsibilities could be a day-long presentation in and of itself. I'll spare you that today. And instead, we'll focus specifically for our time together on the property side. So just on the property. We won't say much about investments. We won't say much about estate gifts. We won't say anything today about incorporation. We'll focus almost exclusively on the managing of the property and the trustee's responsibility when it comes to that. So here's where we're headed. Managing church property, assessments, risk management, insurance, property sales, leases, and then facility use policies. You up for it? Yes? Are you awake? Yes. Do we need a score check to raise or lower anxiety levels?
Hey, quick question.
Yes.
Is the pastor a trustee of the church?
Is the pastor a trustee of the church? The pastor is not a trustee of the church. The pastor can call the meetings. The pastor can offer leadership and guidance. The pastor can convene. The pastor can have a voice. But the pastor is not a voting member of your trustees. Good question. Well, let's start with a couple of different assessments when it comes to property. Accessibility assessments. Have you or your church recently done any accessibility audits or accessibility studies? I'm seeing some heads nodding. Accessibility audits, accessibility assessments are really key in ensuring that our churches are a welcoming, hospitable place for all people, for any different abilities that people might have. And so when we think of accessibility audits, when we examine our properties, we're looking at things like parking spaces and steps, doorways, door handles. Again, how do we make our property, our worship, our ministries, how do we make that accessible to as many different persons as possible? How many people have a sanctuary on the second floor of their building? I see a couple of hands going up. Mark, is your all sanctuary? You have to go up steps to get to your all sanctuary, right? Yeah. Yeah, how many people then have a sanctuary where you've got to climb steps to get into the sanctuary? Yeah, I see a couple of hands going up. It's not always a cheap fix to install elevators or chair lifts, but you can imagine the challenge that somebody might have if they're not able to climb stairs, if they're in a wheelchair. I'm thinking through, how do people access the most sacred space we have? What would it look like for a guest to show up and not be able to make it into the worship space? And so it's always a great idea, a great exercise that during the annual trustee walkthrough, we just ask questions about accessibility. Is our space friendly to people of all different abilities? In a similar way, a guest assessment. And so again, during that annual walkthrough, have you ever, as trustees, walked your property as if you're looking at it for the first time? I know for many of us that have attended the same church or served at the same church for years upon years, we kind of get used to seeing our building the way we want to see it. But again, during that annual walkthrough, it's a wonderful ministry exercise to say, how does our building look to a first-time visitor? Again, there's listed here a couple of things to look at. How do the restrooms look? How does the sanctuary look? What's the cleanliness of these things? Again, it's a really good opportunity for the trustees to care for the property, understanding that the property makes an impression on those that come, those that visit. I'll tell you one little story. At a church I was serving, we were going through this exercise with the trustees. And we were walking the property, we were looking around. And we knew that in that season, we were having a lot of young families and expectant mothers show up to worship, which was phenomenal. And on a Sunday morning, as we were walking around doing some of this looking, we noticed that those people were generally new to the church, unfamiliar with the parking, unfamiliar with kind of the lay of the land, and they were parking as far away as possible. And we saw kind of young families that had 3 or 4 kids trying to herd kids all the way to the building. We saw kind of expectant mothers have long walks, and we thought, what does our building say about who we want to be here, about who is coming, about who we expect, and who we want to be welcoming to? And so the trustees thought, what if we created some special parking spots for young families and expectant mothers? And so it was a real chance for the trustees to think about the ministry of the church. And so without kind of taking spots away from anyone else, we found some signs, I think on Amazon, that said parking for young families and expectant mothers. And we put those in a few strategic places near entrances. And all of a sudden we started to see those spots used by young families, expectant mothers. It was a real kind of fun way for the trustees, through their assessment, to figure out a way to be in ministry, to be welcoming, and to change some of the physical property in service of the mission and the ministry of the church. So again, one of the assessments is a guest assessment. Which of your churches have a parsonage? Anybody still have parsonage? I see a few hands going up. Have you done a parsonage walkthrough lately? Some nodding. Well, parsonage walkthroughs need to be done at least annually, and they need to be documented and reported at the charge conference season. You can imagine the challenges that arise if parsonage walkthroughs aren't conducted, if the church doesn't know what's going on in the parsonage, or if the pastor doesn't feel like the church is involved in the parsonage. And so in the spirit of assessment, eyes and ears around the parsonage by the trustees is really helpful. You know, one of the questions that I used to use when doing a parsonage walkthrough, we as the trustees, we would ask, would I want to live here? That was one of the questions that the trustees would use in gauging maybe the work that needed to be done at a parsonage. Now I got to tell you, this question did backfire a time or two. The more I visited some of my church members in their homes, the more I understood what their perspective was on what a quality parsonage might look like. It's a good question to ask the trustees. And I'll leave it at that. When you do your parsonage walkthrough, would you want to live in the place that you're asking and expecting your pastor to live? The final assessment we'll say a little bit about is risk assessment. And again, you don't have to be an attorney, you don't have to be a professional in building, but again, a walkthrough of your property, again, at least annually, a walkthrough of your property, asking questions about how is this building accessible to all? What does this building look like to a first-time guest? But then assessing the risk that's involved maybe in some of the ministries, some of the spaces, some of the activities that you have going on is always important. Is there anyone here that operates a daycare or a child care facility out of there? I see a hand back here. Does anyone have support groups that meet in your church space? Yes. Another hand back there. What about kind of food banks, clothing things? Mark? We've got some active buildings, which is beautiful. I've always thought that one of the best witnesses to our community is a full church parking lot. To let the church know that there is activity, there is life, there is vitality in this church building. But as you can imagine, any of those activities come with some kind of risk. There might be children involved. There might be adults that are supervising children. There's falls that happen. There's all kinds of things that can go on. And it's the trustee responsibility to assess that and to determine what liabilities might exist given the ministries that we do. Which takes us then to the insurance topic. There are a whole variety of insurances that are helpful, some that are necessary, but a couple of them that come to mind in your policies would certainly be property, it would be general liability, directors and officers liability, pastoral professional, and so if your pastor is doing counseling, I know Kevin could probably speak to that one as well. workers' comp, umbrella, cyber. There's a whole suite of insurance needs that your church needs to have. Well, I do want to pause because there is kind of a foot in the church insurance world. It is getting harder and harder to get insurance for churches. Or said differently, the insurers are getting more and more hesitant to cover churches. And that really exists for two reasons. One is the rise in kind of natural disasters and weather-related claims. We've seen that rise across the country, and so insurers are hesitant. But if I also go back to the risk assessment, insurers sometimes look at churches as risky business. It's not that our ministries are bad, but daycares, support groups, to an insurer, these can be risky things. And so if you, what I want to emphasize is the need to be covered, the need to have a good relationship with your broker or agent, and real due diligence on caring for the insurance needs of your church. If you are having trouble, reach out to me, reach out to Heather. We don't have any magic insurance we can offer you, but we are connected to 3 or 4 brokers that can help your church hopefully resource and uncover some policy options. So if you're having trouble, reach out to us, and we'd be happy to get you connected, hopefully to somebody that can then write your business for you. Any other? Yes?
It's not trouble yet, but what would the church recommend to a church that their insurance company has offered a policy that covers damage by terrorism?
Yeah. So the question was, the insurance company is suggesting terrorism coverage, and is there a recommendation about that? The one question that I would, here's my experience with that. For that coverage to kick in, the act in question typically has to be declared terrorism by the federal government. Which isn't to say that that can't happen or won't happen. We hope it doesn't, right? But there are a lot of acts that might cause damage to our churches for which the federal government isn't going to declare that an act of terrorism. And so for the overwhelming majority of claims and coverages that we might need, that kind of coverage may not be necessary. Does that make sense?
Oh,
yeah. That is a good question. Yes?
What if you had a shooter come in? That wouldn't be terrorism necessarily, but would you need to have insurance for that?
So the question is about an active shooter situation, and where does that fall in insurance coverage? I don't immediately know the answer to that. I would expect that it's covered in general liability. I am not yet aware of unique insurance that's being written for that particular situation, whereas there is insurance being written for terrorism acts. I haven't heard of an active shooter insurance policy yet. Heather, will you make a note so I don't forget this? And I stole your pen. Yeah, it would seem, it could seem to fall under terrorism, but for many of the terrorism coverages, for the terrorism claim to be activated, the federal government would have to declare that act an act of terrorism. And I won't pretend to know or speculate how the government will classify different activities. Again, kind of keeping insurances active, paying attention to deductibles, paying attention to our obligations. We are just in a season of putting insurance needs at the top of the list for a lot of reasons. I love churches helping churches. And so if sometimes your best resource is your neighbor church. They may have an active shooter team, or they may have already been through this. Reaching out to your local church, your neighbor church, for what they've already done, or sharing the wisdom that exists in our connected churches is always a beautiful thing, but also really effective. So thank you for sharing your all's experiences on that.
Many of us could not hear the comments. Could you summarize it briefly?
They're much more eloquent than I am, so I'll try. But the comment was about preparation for active shooter situations, having a game plan. I think the suggestion also was to talk to your local fire department or your local police department. They can be a helpful resource in looking at your building, helping your trustees think through what kind of proactive plan you might need or what can be helpful. Jim's comment was about creating a large, comprehensive emergency plan, whether that emergency is fire or medical emergency of a member, active shooter, the need for a comprehensive emergency response plan. Heather, put that on our list. Got it, good.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah.
Like Jim, I've also got a background in emergency management. I will tell you, for those that are interested, the Department of Homeland Security has some specific reference materials. If I just looked at to make sure I've got what I'm saying. If you'll put it into in your Google, on your phone or your apps or whatever you got, active shooter for faith-based organizations, things of that nature. There are both plan samples and exercises which you could run with your leadership team to help guide you through some of the planning process, as well as other natural disaster things for specifically faith-based organizations. So take a look at some of those resources.
Thanks for pointing us that way, Dick. Well, I want to make mention of one other insurance-related item, and that's workers' comp. Workers' comp is a required insurance in the state of Kentucky. And so if you have a pastor, you have an employee, and you are required to have workers' comp insurance. Now, you may also have additional employees, additional workers beyond a pastor, but at a minimum, if you have a pastor, you have an employee, and you are required to have workers' comp. The premiums are generally not prohibitive, which is good, but again, workers' comp is a required insurance here in the state of Kentucky.
Back to that question, if you have more than 3 employees, is the annual fee the same, or is it higher each person to have?
As far as the premium cost, your premium costs are generally based on a payroll audit. So they'll look at however many employees you have, what's the payroll, and your premiums will be generated based upon payroll. So yes, more employees, higher payrolls will generate a higher premium.
Daycare that is operated, they handle their own payroll.
If the daycare handles their own payroll, and they are a separately incorporated entity,
They're outreach of our church, and our treasurer takes care of it. They have their own bank account.
so the church essentially runs the daycare, It's not a separately incorporated entity. The daycare, in essence, legally, is the church, and the church is the daycare. I would expect that they are employees then of the local church, and the cost would be the church's, and the obligation would be the church's to cover their workers' comp. Now, if you have separate funds that are supporting the church and daycare, there's a way to move the money, but it would be the church's obligation in that construct. Well, perfect. Well, let's shift gears just a little bit and talk about property sales, property leases. I hear a lot from churches about selling property, and we talk with a lot of churches also about leasing property, facility use agreements. So we'll pivot and we'll go down that path for just a moment. So just in general, when we're talking about selling or leasing property, the mission and the ministry matter. The mission and the ministry matter. We'll come back to that several times, but I'll say it again. The mission and the ministry of the church, more than the money, the mission and the ministry of the church matter when making decisions about selling or leasing property. Furthermore, as we said at the beginning, though the trustees have responsibility for sale and leasing decisions, the trustees don't make those decisions alone. The trustees are talking with the rest of the teams in the church. The district superintendent always plays an important role in sale and lease conversations. And then your district committee on building and locations are also important stakeholders in a local church trustee decision about selling or leasing a property. We'll say something in a minute about the proceed usage and also some tax implications when we think about selling and leasing property. So let's start quickly with the selling of a property. Has anybody sold church property lately? A hand is up. Is anybody thinking about selling church property? A hand is up. A couple hands are up. Well, again, prior to any final decision to sell property, those conversations start with the trustees, but they extend and then really begin as a conversation between the district superintendent and the pastor. Again, I expect that the pastor is informed by the trustees, but it is a conversation about the mission and the ministry of the church. And so how does this property sale conversation fit in what the church is doing in mission and in ministry? It's also then the work of the District Building and Locations Committee to consult with the pastor and the district superintendent around any kind of proposed sale. Again, it's some of that's checks and balances, but some of that is about kind of healthy, robust conversations to ensure that decisions we make about selling a property really do serve the mission and the ministry of the church best. And so prior to any sale, you can see a couple of steps, but written consent from the District Building and Locations Committee is required. With that kind of approval, then, it's the local church charge conference that would ultimately authorize the trustees to proceed with solicitation of offers, execution of sale contracts. It's the church conference then, with the permission of those others, that gives the trustees the final authorization to move forward. Any questions about that?
Is that on property only?
Give me an example.
The church building?
It would be on any church property, yes. So again, those written approvals, those written consents, are necessary for the process to move forward. And it would also be required that at the time of sale, those written consents would be a part of all of those sale documents. Part of that, again, is to prevent hasty decision-making. Part of that is to appease closing attorneys. But more important than any of that, all of those different stakeholders, their input is helpful to ensure that the decisions we make about property serve the mission and the ministry we're after as a local church. The final little note I'll say about selling property here is a question that we get a lot. If we get to that point of selling, if it makes sense for the mission and ministry of our church to sell, if we've received all the proper consent and we all feel good about the direction we're going, what can we do with that money? What can we do with that money? And the discipline is pretty clear that money received through the selling of physical property, those proceeds cannot be used to defray or offset, or they cannot be used for just general operational purposes of the church. And so again, you can imagine in very simple terms, this kind of disciplinary requirement would prevent a church, for the sake of the mission and ministry, from simply selling all of its property so that it can pay its light bill next month. Questions about that? We get that question a lot. So let's talk for a little bit as we come down the stretch here about leasing. Is there anyone that currently leases any part of their buildings to an outside group? I see some hands going up. And maybe not in a lease, but share space with an outside group. Anybody doing that? Is there anybody considering these kinds of things? Sharing space, leasing space?
Hey, David, does it matter if there's money exchanged?
Yes. We'll talk about the money. Well, let's talk a little bit about kind of what does it look like to share space or to lease space with a different group. And I'm going to start again here with ministry and mission. Often you might be approached by a group looking for space. Hey, can we rent this spot of your building? Always, again, first and foremost is the mission and ministry. And is the group who's asking, is their mission and ministry consistent with your mission and ministry as a local church? Are you compatible? But a little bit, Shannon, to your point, if you're compatible and you begin to think about sharing space or leasing space, there are, in fact, kind of legal, tax, and financial implications to consider as you go about that. It's also important that a written agreement exists, a facility use policy, or a lease agreement, something that outlines the specifics of the arrangement or the agreement that you are entering into. And then finally, consulting with insurance is always key. The insurance company needs to know who might be using your building, what kind of activities you might be engaged in. That is of utmost importance for your protection. So a couple of slides here at the end, just on that compatibility note. If you're thinking about leasing space, if you're thinking about sharing space, again, is your church's mission consistent with the group that might be asking to use your space? And then that second kind of question, Shannon, it's not exactly to your question, but if you're thinking about sharing space, does the agreement, does the sharing, does it really benefit your church's ministry? Or are you simply looking for a way to bring in some more revenue and bring in some more income. Questions to consider as you're thinking about leasing space. And then finally, will the space we're sharing, will the group we're inviting in, will it interfere with our church's existing plans, our church's existing ministry, our church's existing usage of the space that we're planning to share?
Question.
Yes.
We have AA and Al-Anon in our church. They have been there since time immemorial.
Yes.
I'm sure there's no lease agreement. They give, I think it's quarterly, they give us a donation. It's not really rent. They go out and rent room. How does that fit in?
So the question was about AA or Al-Anon, or could be any kind of support group using your space. And they may or may not give some money. It sounds like in your situation they're providing a donation back to the church. How should that situation be handled? Well, I can't answer it for you all, but I do think on the compatibility question, there are good reasons for why offering space to those groups is consistent with the church's ministry of caring for persons. So I think it makes sense on the compatibility question. I'm going to come back to that and just as we go, Carol, if that's okay.
There was one more thing I wanted to mention. They have never interfered with any church function. If we had a vacation Bible school, they met somewhere else on that day. Once we had a Seder there,
Yeah.
they met somewhere else. And so they don't push us in.
So the comment was made that in this particular arrangement, the group doesn't interfere with other church activities.
They only meet once a week.
They meet once a week.
From 6 to 8, is it?
7 to 8.
That's helpful. Because there are, in that situation or others, certainly kind of legal things that we would want to give consideration to. A couple of those questions are here, related to insurance, to coverage of these groups. Who's carrying insurance if one of these persons falls on church property? Is it the church's insurance that covers that, or is it AA's insurance that covers that? There are other kind of legal liability questions too. I know when I was serving at St. Paul here in Louisville, I think at one time we had 7 AA groups meeting. And so they met 6 nights a week, and one night had 2 groups. And as the AA groups grew in size, the space they needed grew. And we had a couple of incidents where the church youth group was meeting at the same time. And admittedly, we thought we had kind of covered all of our bases on where space were and who was where. But there were some disruptive situations that we had to think about, of where were our kids located and who was supervising the kids while at the same time another group who also wanted to be in the space was meeting. But how did those people share space, and what was supervision, and what were the boundaries? Again, kind of a legal question, but one that we had to give attention to. On that legal note and on that legal liability, one thing I share often with churches, they ask about insurance, and have you ever felt paralyzed by just liability concerns? You just very hesitant, you're very risk adverse, and that's normal, that's natural, that's commendable. Trust yourself on that. But the thing I tell a lot of churches when it comes to legal liability questions, I encourage churches to do 2 things. Do whatever God is calling you to do. Whatever God is calling your church to do, whatever ministry God is calling you to be engaged with, go for it. And second, buy as much insurance as you can afford. Well, again, beyond the legal, there are certainly financial things to consider when it comes to leasing space. Again, it's great to share space, it's great to have groups in, but it's possible that having groups in bring a financial cost, right? We turn the air on longer, we have to have more cleaning services, we have to pay somebody to fix the damage. So there's always a financial implication of having people in, and it's never inappropriate, though, to negotiate again, through a lease agreement, some kind of rent. What might the outside group be willing to pay for the sake of offsetting some of the costs that we might incur? And then finally, the two tax questions that sometimes come up. If we lease property to some non-church group, will that affect our real estate kind of property tax exemption that we enjoy as a church? The answer is generally no. The answer is generally no. Having outside groups in, renting space will generally not jeopardize your church's property tax exemption. I say generally because there are circumstances in which your property tax exemption may be in question. That situation usually occurs when you have so much non-church business happening at your church that it begins to outweigh the church function, right? And so if you become substantially involved in renting space for non-church purposes, such that your building becomes more of a business hub than a place of religious education and worship, you might be in jeopardy of losing some property tax exemptions. The same is generally true for unrelated business income tax. And so churches often ask, okay, we've decided to enter an agreement, we're going to lease out some space, and this third party is going to pay us some rent. Do we have to pay taxes on that rent? Again, generally the answer is no. You can have groups in your space, they can pay you some rent, and you're not going to have to pay taxes on the rent that you earn. Again, the time in which that comes into question is if all of the rent you might be generating becomes a substantial amount of the overall offerings, money, activity of your local church. The other little kicker I'll add to that, sometimes the taxability of that rent depends upon whether or not you have a mortgage on your property. And I think in some previous iteration of this slide, I had a big fancy flow chart, of like, is this taxable income? I've taken that out of here. But if you have questions about that, if you have questions about your tax exemption status, or if rent payments are taxable income, call me or call Heather, and we'd be happy to help you and your church think through the tax implications of renting space. But again, I'll say what I said at the very beginning. Decisions about renting or leasing space should be ministry and mission driven, not money, legal, liability driven. The final thing we'll say about this is simply, we've talked about renting space, we've talked about the dynamics. Any kind of lease agreement, any kind of group that's using your space, memorializing it in a written agreement, in a facility use policy is key. And so, let me just ask, do people have facility use policies? I see some nodding heads, yes. I know that Heather and I have templates we would be happy to share. I'm sure your neighbor churches would be willing to share templates. But outlining in a facility use policy things like what spaces are used, what spaces are available and when, who's going to pay for insurance, what are the rents that we've agreed upon, who covers damage, who covers cleaning. How do we terminate this lease if it's not going favorably? All of those things, all of these decisions and agreements are made much better on the front end than if you try to make them on the fly and course correct if something goes wrong. So carefully outlining how you're going to share space is key. I'll tell you one thing that happened the other day that I don't think Kevin and I were prepared for. But a church had entered a shared space agreement with someone, and come to find out that other someone went on Google and changed the name of the business that was occurring at the church's address. You chuckle. But these are the things that happen when we don't write down well the kind of agreement we're entering into. And so now this church, unfortunately, when people Google their address and when people try to find them online, they don't see the church's name first, if at all. They're now that church's search and address is identified with this other business. Somewhat problematic. So clarity about what we're going to share with the group through a lease agreement, through a facility use policy. Any questions about that? Well, let me then say something else about facility use. It's been a question that we have gotten often. I say a lot. We've gotten it several times. And that's about weddings. And how do wedding building use policies, how do those things happen in the life of a local church? Who decides about weddings in the life of a local church? And the discipline gives us some guidance and some help on this. You know, a wedding is a building use question, right? Somebody is asking to use the building for a wedding. That is first and foremost a trustee decision. That is a trustee conversation. It is a building question. And the trustees don't work alone, right? The trustees work with all of the other groups we've named. The charge conference, the administrative council, the pastor. So any discussion, any decision about a church's wedding policies, though the trustees might be the first group to have that conversation, it should also be a healthy, collaborative conversation with the other decision-making groups in the church, namely the church council. The discipline also helps us understand that the trustees are amenable to the church council. So, wedding policies. Yes, it's building. Yes, it's trustees. And it's in conversation with the church council and other groups. Questions about that? Questions about wedding policies in general?
Your trustees rotate every 3 years.
Yeah.
So is that an ongoing every year conversation? Or is that a once and done?
So the question is about our building policies, wedding policies, are they year to year, or can they be changed? Is that generally?
Yeah, long term is what I would like to see, more than change it every year.
Yeah. I think I've seen churches examine policies every year. I think that's I won't give it a perfect time frame. Every year might not be the right way to approach kind of policy adjustments. But I think any of our church policies are always open to look at them, improve them, reflect upon them. And so I would not suggest that when something is written down as a policy, it is forever fixed as that policy.
Are there like some suggested guidelines on like, a typical rent or sound, or you can use the reception hall or food? You never charge someone to use the facility.
Yeah.
It may or may not be an extension of a member of the church, or
Right.
they may just be a stranger who loves the facade of your church.
Right.
But how do you go about starting that?
Yeah, that's
Kind of conversation, is it $1,000 for 3 hours
Yeah.
in line, or is it like astronomical? So is there any?
that's a really good question, and it was about how might a church charge for its sanctuary or its musicians or its fellowship hall, for its sound. I think that's a really good conversation for local churches. I know that the churches that I've pastored and then been a part of, there has generally been a cost we have assessed for the sanctuary, for the cleaning crew. I think that what you would charge, though, probably depends upon where you're located. I'm aware of some of our larger churches in urban places that will charge thousands of dollars for the sanctuary use. And I'm familiar with a couple of small churches where it's $125, and that gives the wedding party kind of full use of all their facilities. So I would really encourage you to reach out to a neighbor church to figure out if they have a number that they're using.
And then we just need to go below it.
Yes, it depends then on how competitive you want to be. Yes, you can.
I would also add,
Give me your number, I'll give you.
it depends
Yes.
on if you want to have outside weddings in your church or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I served churches that made sure they made the policy high enough that daggone it, if someone else was coming in and using it, we wouldn't make money on it. But they didn't. That church didn't really want people coming in because had been some wedding parties that had just done such a terrible job of respecting the space. So it just depends on what you want to drive, how you want to drive the market.
Yeah. Other questions about kind of facility use things?
Is there anything like strictly prohibited?
In your facility use? Yeah, I think my suggestion to that, my answer or suggestion would be that, again, the mission and the ministry matter, and the groups that are using the space need to be consistent with United Methodist principles. Yep. The final thing I'll say, and I really will be the final thing, is the role of attorneys. And my suggestion to you is to not be hesitant to consult with a local attorney. You may have an attorney in your church. There may be one that's a friend or a neighbor. I could make a lot of attorney jokes, but I won't. I'll just say that they can be helpful to helping us navigate the questions that we have. I know in the local church settings that I've been in, we have consulted attorneys on all kinds of these things. If we need legal advice, if we have questions about a contract we're about to sign, Again, real estate transactions, wills and estates and bequest gifts that might come. Attorneys can be helpful to us as churches, and so I simply want to suggest to not be afraid or to not be hesitant of engaging an attorney if you have those kinds of questions. They can be helpful to you.